All right, we're going to move on to the second section, which is about the contributions and the struggles of Black and Asian American women. What are some of the unique contributions and struggles that women in each of our communities have had to face? We can start with you, Reverend Dr. Waltrina Middleton. Oh, Juliet's going to go first. Okay, Pastor Juliet.
Yes, thank you. So intersectionality is a word that you hear a lot these days, and one of intersectionality's core insights for racial reconciliation is that racism is gendered. That is to say, our gender identities dispose us to different manifestations of racism. So the way I experience anti-Asian racism as an Asian woman is different from the ways that my brothers may experience anti-Asian racism. And this is not to somehow compare ourselves to see who has it better or worse, because the truth is that racism directed to Asian men affects Asian women. And gendered racism directed at Asian women affects Asian men. James Cone writes in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, he says, when Black men were lynched, Black women also suffered. Black women not only suffered the loss of their sons, husbands, brothers, and uncles, but they also endured economic hardship as they tried to carry on, to take care of their fatherless children in a patriarchal and racist society in which whites could lynch them or their children with impunity over the smallest infraction over Southern white etiquette. So our point in talking about the unique struggles that AAPI women face and that Black women face is not to prove that women are more disadvantaged than men, because it affects all of us. It is simply to give us a more comprehensive understanding of how racism and white supremacy operate. So we also address gendered racism tonight because there's also commonality that we find when we explore our experiences as AAPI women and Black women. White supremacy has often treated us in similar ways. And I think that when women share our stories and experiences with one another and hear the pain in each other's stories, as well as the resilience in one another's stories, we can enter into a space of true solidarity with one another. Solidarity that frightens white supremacy. So tonight, Reverend Dr. Middleton and I will share each from our own experiences. As a Chinese Vietnamese American woman, I will share some of my story with you in the hopes that we can find some common ground to lament and to also find common ground to celebrate the different gifts of Asian women and Black women. So two things I want to touch on briefly. One is how racist stereotypes and tropes have dehumanized us and often brought about violence on us. And two, how the white supremacist standard of white beauty has psychological, spiritual, economic, educational, and financial impact on our lives as women. So when I was 16 years old, I went with a friend to a cafe to study. We were in Champaign, Illinois. We were on my college campus. It was late at night. Two older white men who lived in the town approached me when my friend was otherwise occupied and struck up a conversation with me. During that conversation, they asked me intimate details about my sexual anatomy as an Asian woman, and asked for details about any sexual experience I had, claiming that white men often enjoyed being with Asian women because of specific characteristics they had heard they had. At the age of 16, I struggled to even follow the conversation. But I knew that I was uncomfortable. I knew I felt embarrassment for not knowing what they were talking about, embarrassment for the very private and inappropriate questions they asked me. But most vividly, I remember the shame that flooded my face and my body. Not just during the conversation, But afterwards, for decades, I carried the memory of that conversation and that shame as though it had somehow been my fault, that there was something wrong with my Asian female body and who I was as an Asian woman that caused these men to act in the way that they did. Now, sadly, this was not my only experience encountering the ways Asian women are stereotyped and hypersexualized by whiteness in the US. In truth, there is a long history of this that goes back far before our nation. If you go with me all the way back to the 13th century, Marco Polo returned to Europe in the 13th century with tales of mythic-sized erotic encounters in the East that fueled Europe's colonialist drive to Asia. His tales influenced so-called explorers like Christopher Columbus and fed the imagination of writers like Chaucer and Dante. Fast forwarding hundreds of years into the past century and present day, the harsh reality of the sex tourism trade in Southeast Asia has grown largely to fulfill the desires of Western men. In Thailand, for example, there were around 10,000 prostitutes in 1957, but during the US involvement in the Vietnam War, during which Thailand was used as a getaway place for US soldiers for rest and recreation, the number of prostitutes soared to hundreds of thousands and now is in the millions today. Now, I share that because somehow Asian women come away from that having gained notoriety about something about themselves, instead of the story coming out of that it's actually the appetites of Western and white imperialist men that have caused that to grow.
Come on.
Asian women have been stereotyped as hypersexual, then commodified for the pleasure of European and white men, and violence has often followed. And the shootings in Atlanta last 2 weeks ago are a harsh reminder of how true that still is today. And grievously, this is what we see in the history and experience of Black women as well. In our nation's history, enslaved women were considered property, and it was not a crime for a white man to sexually assault her unless her so-called owner disallowed it. And even after emancipation, laws did not prohibit the rape or sexual assaults of women of color. So I know that what I'm sharing is not easy to listen to, and I know for some of us in this room, we carry some of that trauma in our bodies. So I'm just going to invite us to pause right here and take a deep breath in and let it out. Let's do that one more time. Let's just take a deep breath in and let it out. Sadly, as women of color share their stories, we see how racist stereotypes and tropes have dehumanized us and often brought about violence on our bodies. And we carry that trauma in our bodies. We have these stories to tell of what it has been like to have our bodies viewed as property and our existence to be viewed as being for the comfort and pleasure of men. For me, being able to grieve this with my Black sisters and my Asian sisters has brought about healing. And this is something we miss out on when we miss each other's stories. Second, and I'll try to speed it up here, I want to address how the white supremacist standard of white beauty has psychological, spiritual, economic, educational, and financial impacts on our lives as women. As a child, I often went to sleep at night with a clothespin on my nose. I would pinch it during the day. Now, my nose looked exactly like my mother's nose. It looked like my sister's noses. It looked like my auntie's noses. My eyes were also very much like my family's, but rather being proud of the family resemblance, I felt filled with hopelessness. I remember looking at a photo of Christy Brinkley when I was 6 years old. I may be dating myself here. And then looking into the mirror and weeping, because it finally occurred to me at 6 years old that when I grew up, I would look nothing like her. My hair would not be blonde, my eyes would not be white and blue, my skin would not match hers. And I remember asking God, why would you have made me this way? Why do I have to look this way? Why am I not good or beautiful like the pictures of these women? And I know I'm not alone here. Many people are unaware of this, but in Asia, one of the most popular ways for Asian women to spend their discretionary income is on cosmetic surgery. Asians and Asian Americans account for a large part of the growth in the plastic surgery market. Worldwide, the third most common procedure is called a blepharoplasty, which creates a double eyelid in the eye to make it appear larger and more white. The beauty ideal that women face is that white is beautiful. And this doesn't just refer to skin color, it refers to hair texture, to the shape of your nose, to the shape of your lips, to your body type. And this topic is more important even than the value that we associate with ourselves. It's not just about the way that we feel about ourselves, it also has financial, economic, and educational impacts. Dr. Chaniqua Walker Barnes writes in her book, I Bring the Voices of My People. She says, research bears out that across the globe, skin tone and other white standards of beauty have tangible impact upon educational and occupational opportunity, income, marital status, and disparate treatment in criminal justice systems. How closely you fall to the white aesthetic has consequences for how much you get paid, what kinds of disciplinary consequences you experience as a student at your school, what grades you get, what sentence a judge might grant you, who you end up marrying, and how competitive you are in the job market. And the last thing I want to speak to is this. Another thing I believe that Asian women and Black women have in common is that we face not just the burden of racial trauma from white supremacy, but we also carry the burden of patriarchy from within our own community. I thank my brothers for giving me room to address this here tonight. As an Asian woman, I was taught in implicit and explicit ways that my role in life was to first serve my parents, and eventually my husband, and then eventually my children. And even within the Chinese church I grew up in, that role was taught for women because Chinese patriarchal assumptions were brought into the church. As a Vietnamese Chinese daughter, and as a young girl growing up in the Chinese churches I attended, I was taught that it was God's will for me to be dutiful and to be silent, to serve first and foremost my family. But God's will for us is to become beautiful reflections of Him, to become beautiful reflections of Jesus. God's will for His daughters is that they would be filled with the Holy Spirit so that we could offer our voices and gifts for His kingdom and join His mission in renewing the world. And this will sometimes mean that rather than staying silent, we will lift our voices just as Jesus did. And this will sometimes mean that rather than pleasing our parents or our husbands, we worship the Lord God above all others. But the sad truth is that too many Asian women are facing opposition to this in their churches. And the sad truth is that too many of my African American sisters face that as well. And it is an added burden for our lives, but also a place where we can come together. So I offer these brief points to say that as a woman, I believe there are places of commonality for us to come together, and beautiful things happen when we do. Every month, I pray over the phone with Pastor Linda Gorman, who is my Black sister and pastor friend, and her prayers embolden me to speak in ways that my culture did not teach me to speak. I have needed the real friendship of Black women who have shared their painful stories and listened to mine to solidify for me that the things we experience in our bodies as women of color are not right. They are from the enemy. They are not what God intended for us. I have needed to read from a distance authors like Dr. Tanika Walker-Barnes and to hear sermons by women like Pastor Leanne Shaw Younger to gain an imagination for being a woman who exhibits both fierceness and tenderness, who doesn't hold back in silence, but trusts that the spirit the Lord gives us is not one of timidity, but one of power, love, and self-discipline. And that is what happens when we come together.
Testing. Okay, good. I want to echo the sentiments expressed earlier, giving thanks to my new brother for the opportunity to be here, and my family, who I'm privileged to be in this space with today, and each of you. But I want to also give a special expression of gratitude to my new sister, Juliet, who just a couple of weekends ago, not long ago, served as a pastor. And I'm going to share two things that I want you to take with you, and that's moral injury and protracted trauma. In June of 2015, my first cousin was murdered by a self-proclaimed white supremacist while worshiping in the basement of a church. She had to survive 4 daughters who were taken in by her baby sister, who herself was raising 3 children with her husband. And so now my cousin Bethane is raising 7 children with her husband. My family has continued to experience moral injury and protracted trauma as a result of blatant white supremacy in this country that targeted Black bodies in a house of worship. My cousin Bethane, who took in her sister's children while raising her children, died unexpectedly a little over a week ago. My family continued to be traumatized by the pain and the hateful act of one person 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we buried our loved one, and here we are burying the one who took on the mantle of being able to care for and keep the family, those children, together. That's protracted trauma, that's moral injury. While all of this was happening, we were seeing what was unfolding in Atlanta. And I needed to find a place of comfort for my own grief, but also a place of lament for the suffering of my brothers and sisters of my family of Pacific Islander and Asian descent. And Sister Juliet, Reverend Pastor, my friend, welcomed me into her virtual house of worship. And while we were able to lament and grieve for the atrocities that we witnessed as a nation, I also received comfort and love and prayer. And this is what beloved community looked like. And I want to thank you for being present with me. I want to lift up that the woman has been removed from the authorship of her story and from her image in God. Resistance undergirds the womanist movement of which I identify in that it challenges patriarchal prescriptions that have dominated theological pedagogy and its construct of Imago Dei. So I submit that Imago Dei is not fully revealed or affirmed when disconnected from God's womanist feminine self. By denying the humanity of women, the divine is undone. So I call for a movement towards reconciliation, restorative justice, healing, and affirmation for the womanist divine, those that identify as women and those in solidarity and in comradeship with her. Reclaiming women's sacred and whole selves help us to realize a beloved community, one and whole in the divine, which is ultimately healing for all of us. I grew up in the rural Sea Islands of South Carolina, and many of the women I knew defined for me the options and choices and roles I had as a young woman. No one told me that I could not go to college or be independent. However, the images that surrounded me suggested that, much like my sister shared, that I should be reliant upon a husband and that I should, if I go to college, expect to go to a local technical school, or I should learn to play the piano so I could become the local church pianist. I would produce children by marrying or procreating with a man. I would dutifully accept this lot and not challenge it because this course is better than being single, alone, and without opportunities for success. And success was strictly defined by the standards of white male patriarchy, which created the construct of my existence as a woman, and more specifically as a black woman. I was excited to learn the expansiveness of my options and opportunities in the world beyond the Carolinas. And if I wanted to reimagine and explore those dreams, I would also have to carry the heavy burden with me of also being a survival of sexual trauma as I witnessed a young relative raped by an older relative and prominent member of our community. We were both silenced, and we were both even pitted against each other. We were marginalized in our suffering. Our narratives were removed from the equation. The advocacy was for the male leader to be protected in the community, to protect that family's name, and we were told to simply forgive, be good Christians, and simply forgive. The burden and responsibility for reconciliation fell on our shoulders as young women who were harmed. The names, the stigmas, and the like attached to us was unhealthy and further deepened the trauma. What did she do to cause that? Accusations of being fast and promiscuous extended the abuse and the trauma and the labels attached to us, young little girls. This is reminiscent of biblical narratives. The woman has been called out of her name since the beginning of time. We know the story of Eve. Sojourner Truth, in her infamous "Ain't I a Woman" speech, said that the woman who turned the world upside down is portrayed as the sinner, causing punishment by God for tricking man. But if we had the power to turn the world upside down, then we have the power to turn the world right side up. So women have been working enduringly to reclaim her holy likeness and to reclaim and speak her own name, as we have failed to see her, hear her, name her, and to the end love her. With this context, the triad thoughts of prophetic lament, resistance, and proclamation of women, which is especially relevant in this Lenten season as the roles of women here is so important. It is critical for us to collectively as a community work to deconstruct narratives deeming women nameless, powerless, voiceless, and disinherited. We must disrupt biblical canons and disrupt misogyny in our respective locations. Alice Walker, who coined the phrase and founder of womanism, is the author of the novel The Color Purple. And I believe this novel speaks to the truth of sexual violence, sexuality, sexism, and among the other themes in her body of work is a resistance to the status quo, which has marginalized women's narratives virtually non-existent. She lifts it and elevates those narratives and affirms the value and worth in such a poetic way. Alice Walker narrative reminds me of the value and power of women that we see even in this 21st century. The narratives that we heard not just in Ferguson, Missouri, but also in Florida, where we first heard the name Trayvon Martin, which actually is the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. And then, of course, Michael Brown. And even as women, black and brown women, placed their bodies on the line, protesting and honoring the way that this young man's body was exposed in the summer heat of Missouri. Honoring the lives, the stolen lives of young black men that have become virtual hashtags over and over again. Even as women have been invisibilized In silence, women continue to stand on the front line and move not only a suffrage movement, but a movement honoring the bodies and lives and humanity of Black communities, Black bodies. The womanist feminine divine narratives on the socio-political battlefields extend not only to Ferguson, Baltimore, Charleston, Long Island, etc., but is also a global movement. Just look at the Mothers of May in Brazil who march and protest in front of police cities and the favelas, honoring their sons that were killed and murdered by police. We can also go to Palestine and look at the suffering of mothers who remain in the communities as their sons and daughters are kidnapped and stolen in the middle of the night, incarcerated not just for weeks and months at a time, but for years at a time. The women help to uphold not just the other half of the sky, the whole sky. We must honor the narratives of the women. We must honor the suffering of the women. And we must, as sisters in community, continue to be in solidarity. But it is not just the responsibility of women alone. This is a narrative that we must also teach our sons, all of our children. The responsibility of honoring full humanity and body, and to love each and every one of the members of our community. I know the time is up, so I will just conclude with this. I want to share that women have suffered so greatly over the course of time. Behold, the sacred, beautiful, and resilient bodies of Black women. For centuries, our bodies have been vessels of truth-telling. Our bodies woefully sacrificed, raped, stolen, objectified, and commodified. Yet with tenacious courage and truth, we emerge unbowed and restlessly pursuing freedom and justice. The bitter roads we trod tell the tragedies, but it does not erase our trails of triumphs. The stripes upon our backs unveils the sins and crimes against our humanity, but it does not remove our ancestral crowns. We do not seek the praise of humans. Our testimonies give glory to God. The songwriter sings, "My soul looks back in wonder how I got over." With each name etched upon these virtual headstones, trending as hashtags, we bear witness to our burdens and expose the ugly seeds of racism, sexism, poverty, and violence. Our plight is known across the diaspora and may have joined the resistance for change. Still with bloodstained and indisputable evidence of unrighteous harm against our very lives, many remain silent and complicit. Many still fear the judgment of humans more than the justice of God. Many know the unbiased love of God extended to all, and yet they refuse to openly confess truth that Indigenous, Black, and brown lives matter for fear of being outcast or disinherited too. Black women like Sandra Bland, Sarah Lee Circle Bear, Tanisha Anderson, Jane Thompson, Henrietta Lacks, Breonna Taylor, Ayanna Stanley Jones, and a host of unknown have made the ultimate sacrifice. We must unashamedly believe Black women because our lives and our humanity depends on it. Ashe.
As we have Kennedy Maxwell come up to give a response, I just want to say thank you for inviting us into your sacred stories, for sharing those painful experiences with the many to see, and so we appreciate your willingness to convey.
Ni hao, 我的名字叫 Kennedy Maxwell. Today my question today is, how can Black and Asian women put aside their cultural differences to eradicate racism towards all women?
Wow.
a million-dollar question. I think it's worth giving at least a little bit of space for anyone to respond, either Pastor Juliet or Dr. Middleton.
I'm so sorry. Can you repeat the question?
So what can Black and Asian women do in working together to eradicate racism towards all women?
Would you like to go first?
Thank you, first of all, for the question, and very powerful one. I think I will just echo what I shared earlier, and that is the responsibility does not fall solely upon the shoulders of the women. Certainly, we can continue to build solidarity, sharing our stories and building collectively, as I am so grateful for the short time that we have been able to build and bond. But I think being able to transform the ways and the practices and the ways that we nurture our youth, our children, our community, so that we are planting seeds of love and inclusion, so that it does not become this process, a system of isolation where we're fighting one battle here and you're fighting the other. Being able to see that our collective work and responsibility is our true path to liberation. And I will just add, one of my favorite thoughts is the concept of Ubuntu. And Ubuntu means I am because we are. And some will further expand upon that and say, I cannot be all that God has called me to be unless you are all that God has called you to be. So recognizing our interconnectedness and our collective work and responsibility to be unified in one in the movement. Because certainly, brother, poet James Baldwin taught us in his letter to Dr. Angela Bassett that if they come for one in the morning, then we know that they will come for you in the night. So we cannot think that our plight is in isolation, but we are interconnected.
And I think I would add to what's already been shared that, and I offer this in a way, please don't hear me saying it's only the responsibility of women to do this, or that you owe this to the world. But I think as women, we need to realize the power of our stories and the power of what happens when we step into a space and offer our stories of pain. What I've witnessed in my life is the way how that draws other people into that space, and how their stories also begin to be offered, and the world begins to witness something. The world begins to witness what's wrong and what needs to change, and the world begins to witness the power of what happens when we come together. I think as women, we struggle with that. We struggle to lift our voices. We are taught that it's selfish to offer our stories, to take up space. And so I'll just offer, one story I keep coming back to in Exodus is where the Lord calls Moses to go back to Egypt and to be the voice of deliverance for the people of God. And Moses protests 3 times, God, you must not mean me. You got to mean someone else. There's got to be someone better. But what happens is when Moses steps into what the Lord calls him to do, when he steps into what God asks him to do, the way that chapter ends is Moses goes to the people, he tells them that Yahweh has seen them, that he has heard their cries for deliverance, and that he cares for them, and he's gonna do something about it. And then the people fall on their faces and they worship God. That's what happens when any one of us steps into that space and offers our story for the good of the people of God. When we say yes to what God asks of us, the people of God fall on their faces in worship because they hear that God sees them and God cares about them, and he has sent a deliverer. So I think as women, one of the primary ways we do that is by simply being willing to offer our stories and to offer them in lament for our community, and to invite others to share their stories as well.
At this time, we're going to have Sarah Lamb and Quinn Riley come up and share their reflections and their poetry. And then we are going to sing together, so we get a little bit of a stretch break as we worship God together. And so the worship team should get ready to come up after they come.
Tippy toe. Okay. There is no question about solidarity between the Black and Asian American church because it is simply biblical. It's elementary. Let's go back to Sunday school. Jesus Christ said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." The Apostle Paul said, "When one member suffers, all members suffer with it." In these two statements, solidarity is described as an act of love between neighbors and especially fellow believers. To act in solidarity is to love the other as oneself. And love is many things, but it is not without patience. And patient love requires that we commit to learn about each other's histories, to learn each other's stories, and the ways our stories have intertwined. And this patient love requires that we unlearn the lies of white supremacy that has made us believe that we are enemies instead of friends. And let's be honest, white supremacy is a profound spiritual stronghold of oppression. It is dynamic. And of course, learning and unlearning and relearning requires patience, and patience demands our time. And therefore, we take the time to educate ourselves, and we take the time and effort to hold ourselves accountable and hold our communities accountable, our leaders, when we fail to treat each other with love as fellow image bearers and kingdom builders. And the Bible calls us to treat each other with kindness, and kindness is not niceness. It is not appeasing the other person so that they like us. Kindness allows for holy discomfort. It is not comfortable to admit when we're wrong. It is not comfortable to admit when we are spreading misinformation. It is not comfortable to admit that we have been perpetrators of prejudice that stems from white supremacy. Yeah. Holy discomfort and tension should be a catalyst to lead us to repentance and action. So to my Asian American believers, true kindness involves that we lay down our obsession with comfort and our own self-righteousness to recognize and repent of internalized whiteness and anti-Blackness in our congregations. My people, we can no longer sacrifice our Black siblings on the altar of white adjacency. This can be no more. Because when we, as Asian and Black believers, when we get together, we are powerful. As iron sharpens iron, we sharpen each other, we hold each other accountable. I'm accountable to you, and you are accountable to me, to uplift each other and build each other up to become more like Christ. And this is what solidarity calls for. Black and Asian solidarity is simply following the ways of Jesus Christ. It's elementary, and living out what the gospel called us to do. And this means pursuing anti-racism, anti-sexism, and justice for every member of the body. So let me remind you with this, where our two communities gather in the name of Jesus, there the Spirit dwells with us. And tonight, the Spirit dwells with us, and we abide in solidarity. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Quinn. Poetically, I go by Quinology. My mom did give me both names. Before I begin, I would definitely like to thank Pastor Ray for this opportunity, and of course, Pastor Moss for the recommendation. I am an honored member of Trinity United Church of Christ, and every time I hear this man speak, I just get proud all over again, so thank you. This event has me actually kind of shook, so all of the speakers have been phenomenal. But I'm gonna get into this poem. I just wrote it yesterday, so please bear with me. It is untitled. According to ABC News, March 16th at 4:45 p.m., Robert Aaron Long, 21, pulled up to Young Asian Massage Parlor and fired bullets, killing 4 people. Then again at 6 p.m., killing 3 women at the Gold Spa in northern Atlanta. 8 people were murdered. 7 were women. 6 of the 8 people killed were of Asian descent. The shootings took place in businesses owned by Asian Americans. Long, who is white, told investigators the attacks were not racially motivated and claimed to have a sex addiction, which caused him to lash out at what he saw as sources of temptation. The gunmen targeted the massage businesses despite a strip club and a lingerie store nearby. Another hate attack against the AAPI community occurred, making it the 3,795th one this year. I struggle to calculate why this number has passed 1. Soon Shung Park, age 74. Hyun Jung Grant, age 51. Soon Cha Kim, age 69. Yong A Yu, age 63. Zhao Jie Tan, age 49. And Dao Yo Feng, age 44. I wonder if white Americans take the term Asian takeout seriously, replace cartons for carcasses of bodies. I wonder when the chopsticks replace cuss words and lazy tongues to not pronounce names or ethnicities, but blistering words to only cut, to only dice, to only disrespect cultures. Well, we all know that white people love Asian culture, just not Asian people. We all know that white people love black culture, just not black people. In this melting pot of a country, we all know who is used for the seasoning, whose blood is broth, whose remnants are digested. U.S. full of pigment, full of color. On TV, in the movies, I can always count the number of black people on one hand, and I promise you the same can be said for Asians. White people love seeing Asians as doctors or tech gurus, but never alive and loud, only actor, never actual human being. Maybe it's easier for me to see the racism because I too have been seen as a Ku Klux Klan appetizer. I too have a eulogy written on the tip of my tongue. The bullets that have cracked open black bodies are released from the same people who have slain the Asian ones. Guns, rope, church bombings, slavery, intermittent camps. We both have the same oppressor, the same systemic injustice regressor. Whiteness, the tightness in my fist, the anger in my belly for this massacre is even louder, and yours should too. March 16th was not just my mama's birthday, but a divine reminder of the work that we have to do, to not just pray, but yell, to not just ask, but demand. I mean, damn, why am I only told to rest in peace if my body is in a casket? When will I be able to stop fighting for freedom and live it like my ancestors' dream? My ancestors' blood still leave a residue in that White House. And in white mouth saying the Pledge of Allegiance, allegedly, people say the Atlanta murder wasn't a hate crime, as if bullets are a love language and not a signal for war, as if the lynchings were decorations for trees and not direct threats, as if the rapes were accidental and not forced entry, as if the insurgency on DC was just a simple gathering at the Capitol. It is important to call things what they are and not to pretend. Stop anti-Asian hate. The hate has to end, and during this pandemic, there is no mask that can stop the spread of this particular virus that has infested the minds and hearts of many. The only solution is love, people power, and identifying the true enemy. I know. I have friends that have been surveilled at the beauty supply stores. The names of black girls like Latasha Harlins sit in the back of my throat like unswallowed food. I know that blacks and Asians have not always gotten along. But we both know the song of racism and sexism too well. Our bodies have always been compared to food or something with an expiration date: dim sum, gumbo, sweet and sour chicken, macaroni and cheese, red curry. Men look at us but never see us. To them, we are sparkling and exotic. An obsession with our lips, thighs, eyes, and hair, but never our mind, because to a white man, that does not exist in a woman, let alone a black one, let alone an Asian one. We do look different and experience different things, but in society, our struggle has the same bully. Can you imagine how powerful it would be to come together? The people against the oppressor. Can you direct your anger to the root and not a side effect? Will you? Will you? Thank you.